My name is Dr. Kenneth Cottrell, and I am from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But this history is a personal to me because I am from Atlanta, Georgia. I attended Morehouse College and clerked for Congressman John Lewis and Georgia State Representative Billy McKinney, and grew up listening to the stories about the Civil Rights Movement, not simply as history, but as a living memory. After my father died, my uncle Melvin Robinson became a especially important influence in my life. He was a civil rights attorney, and I began working for him while still in middle school. Through him, I learned about the partnership between Atlanta's Black and Jewish communities. He helped me understand that the civil rights movement was sustained not only because of iconic speeches, nationally recognized leaders, but also by attorneys, clergy, congregation, businesses, families, and civil relationships built over many years. He also exposed me to the idea that stayed with me, that 1958 helped shape the modern civil rights movement. Today, I want to revisit the year that is often treated with the interval of history of the civil rights movement, 1958. My presentation shared struggles, Dr. King, Rabbi Rothschild, and the interfaith civil rights leadership in Atlanta, 1958. The central question is simple. When did the Atlanta Black and Jewish Civil Rights Coalition actually begin? The familiar story starts with the prominent leaders meet, exchange letters, issue statements, or appear public together. I want to move to the starting point earlier. I argue that a coalition began before a formal partnership through shared experience. My claim is that 1958 is not the log, it is the start. Civil rights narrative often moved quickly from confrontation at Little Rock in 1957 to the student sit-ins that began in Greensboro in 1960. In that familiar chronology, 1958 can seem like a waiting room, a quiet space between two defining moments. But Atlanta was not waiting. During 1958, the city's Black and Jewish communities were named together by white supremacists, attacked during the same season, and pushed to answer violence in public. They did not yet operate through the former alliances between Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Rothschild. In fact, the two men have yet met. That absence is not a weakness in evidence, it's a point of the argument. If we look only at for contact between the famous leaders, we miss the conditions that made the later contact meaningful. Shared danger created recognition before partnership created organization. So I'm proposing that 1958 as the founding year of the Atlanta Coalition, not because of the institution was established that year, because a common political experience became visible and legible to both communities. This requires a shift in method. A conventional partnership argument need direct evidence, meetings, correspondence, joint statements, coordinated action. None of that exists between Dr. King and Rabbi Rothschild in 1958. The two men met later through a Atlanta dinner group. A Shakespeare argument asks for a different kind of evidence. Both communities lived through the same political process at roughly the same time. Were described by their opponent as part of the same threat? Did they interpret violence through their own religion and civic traditions in the ways that is converged? That evidence doesn't exist. It is dated. It is archived. It appears in propaganda, FBI records, sermons, newspapers, organizational resolution, and private letters. I am not claiming that parallel experience is identical experience, nor am I claiming that solidarity emerged automatically. I am arguing through shared experience created the basis for this recognition. It gave it later leaders through language and memory and a civic setting in which partnerships could develop. The presentation then is about the year before the meeting, the year that made the meeting matter. The chronology turns to 22 days. On September 20th, 1958, Dr. Martin Luther King was signing copies of Stride Towards Freedom in a Harlem bookstore. A woman approached him and drove a steel letter opener into his chest. The blade rested dangerously close to his aorta. King survived after hours of delicate surgery. 22 days later, on October 12th, 1958, 50 sticks of dynamite tore through the Temple Synagogue on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. It's where Rabbi Rothschild served as the rabbi. This explosion caused enormous damage, but caused it to occur in the morning of the facility when no one was at the place to be physically injured. These attacks differ. King was assaulted by an individual in New York. The temple was bombed by an organized white supremacist group in Atlanta, which did not collapse these distinctions. But the place of evidence beside one another, two cities, two faith, two forms of violence, one autumn. Both attacks targeted public figures and institutions associated with racial and religious chains. Both demanded a response, and the two men at the center of those responses have never met. The proximity of those attacks makes it a shared political season visible. The first shared experience was the rhetorical. Black and Jewish communities were named as enemy number one. This this presentation on the slide comes from a white supremacist propaganda circulating in Atlanta. The Christian anti-Jewish flyer places Jewish organization behind the racial integration and racial desegregation of schools. The National States Flyer Party membership application binds opposition to integration and opposition to so-called Jewish influence with the same pledge. This matters because the coalition was not formed by those two who joined them. Sometimes an adversary constructs the category first. White supremacists organized did not treat Black political advancement and Jewish civic participation as separate problems. They fused them into one conspiracy: anti-Semitism, supply, and explanation for desegregation. Anti-Black racism supplied the social order that propaganda promised to defend. This language was strategic. It told white audience that integration was not the result of Black citizenship claims, constitutional litigation, or local organizing. Instead, it portrayed the change as outside manipulation by the Jews. That fiction allowed segregationists to attack both communities at once while denying the legitimacy of either. So before Dr. King and Rabbi Rothschild recognized one another as partners, their opponents placed them in the same political frame. That is the first mechanism of a shared experience. That is where they are mutually visible through the language used against them. The coalition's earliest boundary, in other words, was drawn by people trying to prevent it. The Atlanta bombing was not an isolated act. It belonged to a regional campaign. Across 13 months, eight sites in 6 states were bombed or targeted or attempted bombing. The campaign crossed the city and state lines, moving through a network of white supremacist activism rather than a local single government events. Jacksonville gives us the clearest example of how anti-Black and anti-Semitic violence operate together. On April 27, 1958, explosions struck through a Black synagogue and a Jewish community center. Essentially at the same time, a similar bomb exploded at an all-Black James Weldon Johnson Junior High. One night, one campaign, two communities. The pattern continued elsewhere. Miami, Nashville were struck on the same day in March. In Peoria, where people were struck only 2 days after the Atlanta bombing. These incidents reveal a shared geography of the reaction. The targets were selected because they represented challenges to the racial and religious boundaries that white extremists, wanted to enforce. This broader map changes how we interpret the temple bombing. It was not simply an episode in Atlanta Jewish history. It was a part of a regional counterattack against desegregation, civil rights activism, and institutions that believed to support them. The violence connected the community geographically before leaders connected them organizationally. The second shared experience was a direct attack on the same season. To understand why the temple became the target, we need to understand Rabbi Rothschild's public role. He arrived in Atlanta in 1946 and denounced the segregation from the pulpit the following year. This was an abstract theological position. He knew challenging segregation could expose both himself and his congregation to danger. In 1957, Rabbi Rothschild would help draft the Minister's Manifesto, a statement by the Atlantic clergy calling for a modernization and a lawful compliance in school desegregation crisis. Yet, he withheld his own signature. He wanted the Christian church to lead publicly rather than allowing opponents to dismiss the statement by Jewish interference. This decision reveals both the courage and constraint. Rabbi Rothschild was deeply involved, but he understood that anti-Semitic propaganda could be used against the discredit on an interracial cause. He stepped back so that Christian ministers could occupy the visible foreground. Then the bomb exploded. 50 sticks of dynamite caused approximately $100,000 to $200,000 in damage. 3 weeks later, Rabbi Rothschild signed the stronger Second Minister's Manifesto. The bombing did not remove him from civic life. It clarified the cost of silence. The movement from strategic restraint to public recommitment is central. He stepped back so others would lead. He stepped forward after the bombing of his building. King's stabbing, the temple's bombing were not equivalent events, but they turned to each other's leader's body or the institution into a site of a political violence. Each attack tested whether public commitment will retreat under the threat. In both cases, the answer is no. The third shared experience was interpretive. Both leaders answered through violence through scripture and religious ethics, each within his own tradition. On September 30th, 1958, while recovering from in a Harlem hospital, King publicly forgave his attacker and restated his commitment to nonviolence. His response placed suffering within the Christian moral framework. Violence would not determine on the terms of his politics, and the retaliation would not become his answer. On October 13th, 1958, the day after the temple bombing, King wrote to President Eisenhower. He urged the president to convene at the White House conference to devote to a peaceful settlement and differences. Dr. King moved from a personal forgiveness to a demand for a national civic leadership. 4 days later, Rabbi Rothschild preached, and none shall make them afraid, to an overflow congregation. The title, drawn from the prophet Micah, had already gone out in the temple bulletin on October 16, 1958. It also stood outside on the lawn of the damaged building. That detail mattered. The title was not a retrospective interpretation added years later to it. It was the congregation's immediate publicly in days following that bombing. Neither man was quoting the other. Neither response depended on a personal condition. Dr. King answered through Christian nonviolence. Rabbi Rothschild answered through Jewish scripture, and the prophet promised that people might live without fear. That tradition remains distinct, but the public conclusions converge. Violence must not produce fear, retreat, or vengeance. Religious language became civic language. It translated suffering into a claim about how Atlanta and the nation outright respond. This coalition, before the contact, no sameness, but a moral resonance. But the experience was never fully equal. The fifth element of the framework is what is not shared protection. Within 48 hours of the temple bombing, Black Line became, namely, the disparity. On October 14, 1958, the Atlanta Baptist Association condemned the bombing. In the same resolution, it deplored the official silence over attacks of Black churches and homes. Similarly, on October 15th and October 23rd, the Atlanta Daily World criticized the direction of the investigation, including pursuit of a Black suspect. The newspaper asked why comparable federal attention had been absent when Black institutions were attacked. In a letter to Ralph McGill, editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Annie Moore contrasted that the public response to the temple to that of the silence followed at the 1951 assassination of her father, Harry T. Moore, Florida's NAACP director, who was killed by a bomb beneath his home. These were these were not later scholarly caveats, but Black Atlanta raised them immediately. The targeting, the shared, the protection was not. This distinctive prevents the language of shared struggle from becoming romantic. Jewish Atlantis encountered real anti-Semitic violence, and the bombing generated widespread fear. At the same time, Black Atlantis recognized that the extraordinary law enforcement attention, political combination, and public sympathy following the synagogues bombing had often been denied to the Black victims. Unequal protection was therefore not an outside by a coalition story. It presented the coalition from the beginning. It created both a bias and solidarity and a source for the future strain. Any framework that included shared danger must also ask who receives recognition, investigation, and protection after that danger becomes real. When what did this beginning produce? This bombing was meant to isolate Rabbi Rothschild and intimidate his congregation. Instead, it connected him to a much wider civic network. The symphony letters and then the Rabbi Rothschild's papers came in from a Presbyterian church, the Herndon Foundation representing Black Atlanta's business establishment, a synagogue in California, the Jewish the Jewish Nashville Community Center, which had itself been bombed 7 months earlier, and the Atlanta Chief of Police and members of Congress. The variety matters. These letters do not represent one established coalition speaking with a single voice. They show multiple civil constituents moving towards in the same damaged institution. The attack created a public space where recognition would become a relationship. That space helps explain what followed. Dr. King moved back to Atlanta in the end of 1959. In 1963, after King's arrest in Birmingham, Rabbi Rothschild wrote in support of him. In 1965, Rabbi Rothschild helped him organize the banquet honoring Dr. King after he received the Nobel Peace Prize. That banquet brought together roughly 1,300 to 1,400 guests and became Atlanta's first large integrated banquet. The later partnership was real, visible, and consequential, but it did not appear out of nowhere in 1965. Its groundwork had been laid in 1958 through common targeting, parallel religious response, public sympathy, and a civic network activated by violence. The bombing failed on its own terms. It was meant to isolate them, it connected them. Let me put the whole argument to one frame. There are five shared experiences. First, Black and Jewish Atlantans were named as enemy number one by white supremacist propaganda, fused by integration and Jewish influence into a single threat. Second, they were attacked in the same season. Dr. King's stabbing, the temple's bombing occur only 22 days apart within a broader regional campaign. Third, the attacks were answered from scripture through both traditions. Dr. King responded through Christian nonviolence and forgiveness. Rabbi Rothschild responded through Jewish prophetic language and refusal to be ruled by fear. Fourth, coalition was built on the same civic space. The letters, the clergy statements, newspaper, business institution, and later dinner networks created a place where a shared experience became a durable relationship. Fifth, the communities were protected unequally. Black Atlanta identified the gap between response to the synagogue bombing and the neglect that followed attacks on Black people, churches, schools, and homes. This reframing changes three things. It makes 1958 the founding of Atlanta's coalition rather than an interval to speak. It shows the coalition forming through and shared experience rather than beginning only with the contact between its leaders, and is placed for unequal protection inside a framework from the start. Instead of appending it later, it uses caution. For the experience made the coalition problem. The fifth set the terms against which it will later be strained. Contested histories are often made in the years that were skipped. 1958 has been treated as a quiet year between Little Rock and Greensboro. It was not quiet. It was the year that Atlanta's Black and Jewish communities were named as enemy number one, attacked in the same season, answered violence through answered violence from two traditions of shared moral language before Dr. King and Rabbi Rothschild ever sat down together. This does not erase the difference between the community and does not turn later coalition into a inevitable outcome. It shows us the condition under which solidarity became imaginable. If we began with only the photograph of Dr. King and Rothschild together in 1965, we see a partnership. If we return to 1958, we see how that partnership became possible. And also we see the inequality it is carried from the beginning. For me, the history reaches to the present. Today, Georgia is represented in the United States Senate by two Democrats, Reverend Raphael Warnock, an African American pastor who leads Ebenezer Baptist Church, home of Dr. Martin Luther King, and Senator John Ossoff, Georgia's first Jewish U.S. Senator. I do not present their election as an inevitable outcome from 1958. History is never that simple, but their service together reflects the continuation of a civic and political relationship that Atlanta's Black and Jewish communities helped build across generations. What began in 1958 did not end with Dr. King and Rabbi Rothschild. It helped create a model of a coalition that continues to shape Georgia and the nation today. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.